The wind carried more dust than hope across the cracked plains of West Texas. It was the summer of 1882, and Margaret Sullivan was 3 months from losing everything. The land had forgotten the taste of rain. The sun baked the earth until it split like old leather, spiderwebs of despair stretching to the horizon. Margaret stood on her porch, one hand shielding her eyes, the other gripping a bucket until her knuckles were bone white. She was 26, but grief and hardship had carved her face into something older, something severe. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 8 months. An accident, they called it. A snapped rope, a falling tree. They said he didn't suffer. But Margaret had seen the body. She knew that was a lie people told widows to make themselves feel better. Now it was just her. Her, a 4-year-old son named Samuel, and 40 acres of stubborn land that was dying right before her eyes. "Mama?" Samuel's voice was a thin, worried thread from the chicken coop. "The chickens are acting strange again." Margaret knew what it was. The well was running low. Each trip down that dark hole felt like tempting fate. One slip and her son would be an orphan. She lowered the bucket, the rope burning her palms. She counted the seconds until the faint splash. Too many seconds. The bucket came up barely half full, the water murky and sad. Her 20 head of longhorn cattle were already showing ribs. They stood in whatever shade they could find, their spirit beaten down by the heat. Each dead calf was another nail in the coffin of her independence, and some people were just waiting to hammer that coffin shut. "Mrs. Sullivan." The voice made her jump. Elijah Morse, the banksman, stood at her gate. His city clothes looked ridiculous in the heat, wilted and out of place. He was a thin man with the patient, predatory eyes of a vulture. He always showed up when people were at their weakest. "Mr. Morse," she said, not moving to invite him in. "Concern for your welfare, ma'am," he said, taking off his hat. The gesture was meant to be polite, but the calculating gleam in his eyes ruined it. "The bank's been reviewing its accounts." "My husband's death doesn't change my ability to work this land," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but fear was a cold snake coiling in her gut. "Of course not," Morse agreed, far too quickly. "But a woman alone, with a child. Perhaps you'd consider selling. I could arrange a fair price." "This is my son's inheritance," she said, her voice like flint. "I will not sell." Morse's smile tightened into something ugly. "The next payment is due in 2 months, Mrs. Sullivan. I do hope you'll have it." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and I heard you had some trouble at Grayson's store yesterday. Something about your credit." Heat flooded her face. The humiliation of being turned away for feed, the whispers of the other customers, it still stung. "Good day, Mr. Morse," she said, her voice ice. After he left, she leaned against the well's edge, letting the shaking start. It wasn't just the bank, it was the town. A widow running a ranch, wearing men's trousers to work cattle, refusing to remarry. It was a scandal. Just last Sunday, Mrs. Henderson had moved to a different pew in church, as if widowhood were a disease you could catch. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her day after day. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, she saw him, a dark speck against the glowing horizon, a rider moving slowly. Horse and man both looked exhausted. Margaret's hand went to the rifle propped against the porch rail. Strangers were rarely good news, especially for a woman alone. As he got closer, she saw the details. The horse was a bay, favoring its left front leg. The rider was tall, even slumped with fatigue, worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, a cowboy, but not one she recognized. He stopped a respectful distance from the house, pushing back his hat. The face underneath the trail dust might have been handsome once. Dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale blue, almost gray. But it was the weariness in those eyes that caught her. It wasn't just physical. It was a bone-deep tired, the kind that comes from carrying too many miles and too many memories. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, cracked with dust. "Name's Jake Ryland. Sorry to trouble you, but my horse threw a shoe. Wondering if I might use your tools to fix it. I can pay." Margaret studied him. His gun belt was well maintained, the mark of a man who didn't look for trouble, but was ready for it. His hands were calloused but clean. There was a quiet respect in his manner that eased her suspicion, but only a little. "There's a forge in the barn," she said finally. "Hasn't been used since." She stopped, not wanting to speak of Thomas to a stranger. "I'm handy with horses," Jake said, "and if you have any other work, I'd be glad to trade labor for a meal. Been living on jerky and memories for too long." Samuel crept out onto the porch, peering from behind her skirts. Jake noticed him and touched the brim of his hat. The boy ducked back, shy. "Fine boy you've got there," Jake said. "About my nephew's age, back in Missouri." The mention of family eased another fraction of her fear. Drifters didn't talk about kin. "The forge is in the barn," she repeated. "Supper's at sunset. Beans and cornbread." "Ma'am," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "After 3 weeks on the trail, that sounds like a feast." He dismounted carefully, favoring his left side. An old injury, not a new one. As he led his horse to the barn, she watched the way he moved. Alert, but not aggressive. Like a man who'd learned to read danger in small signs. "Mama," Samuel whispered. "Is he staying?" "Just for supper," she said firmly. But as she headed inside, she found herself adding an extra cup of beans to the pot. It was just Christian charity, she told herself. Nothing more. But as the sun bled across the horizon, she couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger's arrival was not a coincidence. It felt like fate. And in West Texas, fate was rarely kind. The morning sun crept through the cabin window, casting long shadows. Margaret had been awake for hours. The knowledge of a stranger sleeping in her barn put an edge on the silence. She'd let him stay the night after he'd not only fixed his horse's shoe, but also mended a broken gate and patched the chicken coop. All before supper. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and unsettling. She glanced through the window and saw him at the pump, washing his face. When he looked toward the house, she stepped back quickly, annoyed at being caught watching. "Is the man still here, Mama?" Samuel asked from his small bed. "Mr. Ryland," she corrected. "And yes, he is." "Can he stay? He fixed my wooden horse." Samuel held up the toy Thomas had carved for him. It had been broken for weeks. Now it was whole again. A lump formed in her throat. A knock at the door made her jump. It was Jake, hat in hand. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan. Came to thank you and settle up before I move on." "You mended the gate," she said. "We're square." He studied her for a moment, those pale eyes seeing more than she liked. "That roof needs work. So does the corral fence. And unless I miss my guess, that windmill hasn't turned right in months." It was all true. A list of repairs that grew longer each day. "That's not your concern, Mr. Ryland." "Could be," he said, shifting his weight. "I'm not in any particular hurry. If you could use a hand for a few days, I work for food and a place to lay my head. Your barn is more comfortable than most places I've slept." She should have said no. The gossips in town would have a field day. But her pride wouldn't fix the roof. Her pride wouldn't keep the cattle penned. "I can't pay wages," she said, her voice stiff. "Didn't ask for any," he replied, settling his hat on his head. "I'll start with the roof." And so it began. An arrangement she told herself would only last a few days. But the days stretched into a week, then two. Jake Ryland was a hard worker who kept a respectful distance. He ate his meals with them, but returned to the barn quickly after. He didn't pry. It was Samuel who broke through his reserve. The boy followed him like a shadow, asking endless questions that Jake answered with surprising patience. "Were you in the war?" Samuel asked one evening. Margaret stiffened, but Jake just nodded. "I was. Just a boy myself." "Did you kill anyone?" "Samuel!" Margaret scolded, but Jake held up a hand. "It's a fair question. Yes, son, I did. And it's nothing I'm proud of. War makes men do things they spend the rest of their lives trying to forget." The shadows in his eyes deepened, and Margaret understood a little more of his bone-deep weariness. The next morning brought trouble. 3 riders from town, Bob Hutchkins from the saloon, Carl Meyer from the general store, and Pastor Williams. "Gentlemen," she said coolly from the porch. "Heard you got yourself a hired man, Widow Sullivan," Hutchkins began, his face red from drink. "Living in your barn, eating at your table," Meyer added, his face pinched with disapproval. "People are talking." People always talk, Margaret replied. It has yet to bring rain or mend a fence. Pastor William stepped forward, his expression oozing condescension. Mrs. Sullivan, we're concerned for your reputation. A young widow, a strange man. Surely you see how it looks. What I see, she said, her voice sharp as broken glass, is that none of you offered to help when my roof leaked. Mr. Ryland works for his keep, nothing more. Now see here, Hutchkin started, but he stopped dead. Jake had appeared around the corner of the house. He held a hammer in his hand. Gentlemen, Jake said mildly. But there was nothing mild about the way he stood. It was a relaxed posture that promised instant, efficient violence. All three men shifted uneasily on their horses. Fine morning, Jake continued. I was just about to patch that hole in Mrs. Sullivan's roof. Unless you're here to help, I'd best get to it. The silence was thick with tension. Margaret realized with a jolt that this quiet man had faced down far worse than three-town busybodies. We're only thinking of what's best, the pastor said, already backing his horse away. I'm sure you are, Jake replied. Good day to you. After they left, Margaret's hands were shaking. They'll make trouble. Maybe, Jake said, but men who ride in groups to bully a woman usually back down when they are faced directly. He paused. If my being here is causing you grief, I'll move on. No. The word was out before she could stop it. There's still work to be done. That night, he told her a little of his story, a ranch in Kansas, a wife named Emily who died of a fever. He'd sold the place, unable to bear the memories. Been drifting ever since, he said, staring into the fire. 5 years now. Thought I was looking for something, but maybe I was just running. Running is sometimes all we can do, she said softly. When Thomas died, I wanted to run. But this land, it's all Samuel has of his father. It's good land, Jake said, worth fighting for, especially against drought and debt and gossip. He looked at her, and his gaze was so direct it felt like a touch. You're stronger than you know, Margaret Sullivan. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Something electric passed between them. She looked away, rising abruptly. It's late. But as she lay in bed, she thought of the quiet strength in his hands, the way he'd stood up for her. For the first time in 8 months, she didn't dream of her husband's crushed body. She dreamed of pale blue eyes and the sound of a hammer on the roof, steady as a heartbeat. The next morning, she made extra biscuits and put a spoonful of her precious jam on his plate. When he smiled at her, a real smile that reached those weary eyes, she felt something inside her chest crack open. It was hope, and she knew, with a sudden, terrifying certainty, that hope was the most dangerous thing of all. The drought tightened its grip like a fist slowly closing. By the 3rd week of Jake's stay, the grass had crumbled to dust. The well was nearly dry. The cattle were walking skeletons. We'll lose them all if we don't move them to water, Jake said one evening, his voice grim. The nearest water is Clear Creek, Margaret replied, her arms crossed tight against her chest. 20 miles. It's a 2-day drive. They're too weak. Then we'd best start tomorrow, Jake said simply. We go together, she interrupted, before he could offer to go alone. They're my cattle, my responsibility. He just nodded, a look of respect in his pale eyes. They left before dawn, pushing their reluctant animals into the haze of dust and heat. Samuel was with the Johansons, their kind neighbors. Will you come back? He'd asked, his small voice full of fear. I'll always come back to you, she'd promised, the words catching in her throat. The first day was brutal. That night, they made camp in a small box canyon. The stars were brilliant in the black sky, a cold, distant beauty. You handle those cattle like you were born to it, Jake observed, passing her a cup of coffee. My father raised beef back in Tennessee, she said. I could rope and ride before I could read. She paused. Thomas never liked that about me. Said it wasn't fitting for a woman. Thomas was a fool then, Jake said bluntly, then caught himself. Forgive me. He's dead, she said with a shrug that didn't hide the old hurt. And he was a fool about some things. He wanted a wife who'd be content with sewing. He got something else entirely. He got someone who could save his legacy, Jake corrected, his voice low. That's worth more than all the needlepoint in the world. They sat in silence, a comfortable quiet that felt new and fragile. Then a sound made them both freeze. horses, moving fast in the darkness. Jake was on his feet in an instant, his hand a blur as it went to his gun. "Easy there, friend," a voice called out of the night. Three riders emerged into the firelight. Margaret's heart sank. She knew the leader, Bill Carver, a hard man who ran cattle for the big ranches and had a reputation for taking what he wanted. "Well, well," Carver said, his grin showing tobacco-stained teeth as his eyes landed on Jake. "Jake Ryland. Been a while since Dodge City." Jake's whole posture changed. He became looser, but somehow more dangerous. "Still riding with trash, Carver, I see." "Now that ain't friendly." Carver's eyes slid over to Margaret, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "This your woman, Ryland? Pretty thing to be dragging through the desert." "The lady is driving her cattle to water," Jake said, his voice flat and even. "We want no trouble." "Cattle?" One of Carver's men laughed. "Them walking skeletons? Hardly worth the trouble. Maybe there's other things worth taking, though." Margaret stood up slowly, her hand drifting toward the rifle on her saddle. "You're on my land, Mr. Carver. I'll ask you to move along." "Your land?" Carver mocked. "Way I hear it, you're just a widow playing rancher. Maybe you need a real man to show you how it's done." What happened next was so fast she almost missed it. Jake's gun cleared leather in one smooth, impossible motion. The crack of the shot echoed in the canyon. Carver's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched through the crown. "Next one goes lower," Jake said, his voice conversational, almost calm. "The lady asked you to move along." The air was thick with the promise of violence. Carver slowly bent down, picked up his hat, his face a mask of fury. "This ain't over, Ryland," he snarled. He looked at Margaret. "You neither, widow woman." After they'd gone, the silence they left behind was deafening. Margaret was trembling. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake's jaw was tight. "We had a disagreement in Dodge. Over a woman he was bothering. Will he come back?" "Maybe," Jake said. "We'd best keep watch." They reached Clear Creek at midday, the sight of the green trees and flowing water so beautiful it made her want to weep. The cattle surged forward, drinking deep. They'd made it. That evening they camped on high ground. The encounter with Carver had shattered any sense of safety. "My wife Emily," Jake said suddenly, his voice soft with memory and pain. "She was like you, strong, could outride most men. When she died, I blamed myself, sold everything and started drifting. Figured I didn't deserve another chance." He looked at her across the small fire. "But then I rode up to a widow's cabin and found someone fighting the whole world just to keep her son's inheritance safe. Made me think maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe fighting for something was." Their eyes met. The electric connection was back, stronger this time. She reached out, touching his hand. He turned his palm up, his fingers lacing with hers. "Jake," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I know all the reasons this is complicated, but Margaret, A shot rang out, shattering the night. Jake moved faster than she could think, tackling her, pulling her down behind the rocks as more bullets whined over their heads. "Stay down," he yelled, drawing his gun and firing back at the muzzle flashes in the darkness. Carver had come back, and this time he'd brought friends. Margaret crawled to her rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear them shouting, circling on horseback. A bullet sparked off a rock near her head, and she fired back, the recoil jolting through her. Jake fought with a terrifying cool precision, making every shot count. Margaret backed him up, keeping them from being flanked. Someone screamed in pain. "Pull back!" She heard Carver's voice curse. "Pull back!" The sound of hooves faded into the night. Jake stayed crouched for a long time before finally straightening. "You hurt?" he asked, his hands running over her arms, her shoulders, checking. "No, you." "I'm good." He pulled her against him then, a sudden, desperate hug. His heart was racing as fast as hers. "Damn brave woman. Margaret Sullivan." She clung to him, the solid warmth of his chest a shield against the world. He pulled back to look at her, the moonlight silvering his face. There was something in his eyes, something that made her breath catch in her throat. But the moment passed. They had cattle to round up. As they started the journey home, the refreshed cattle moving with new strength, Margaret knew something had changed forever. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for a future, and she wasn't fighting alone. Word travels fast in a small town, and bad news travels fastest of all. By the time they drove the herd back to the ranch, she could see riders in the distance, watchers sent to report back to the gossips. The widow Sullivan had spent 3 nights alone on the trail with her hired man. The scandal was just beginning. "Let me take Samuel into town for supplies tomorrow," Jake suggested as they unsaddled. "Might be easier if you stay clear for a few days." Margaret's hands stilled. "I won't hide in my own home like I've done something shameful. It's not about shame. It's about choosing your battles." She turned to face him, her chin high. "I've been choosing my battles since the day Thomas died. I won't start running now." That night, after Samuel was asleep, she found Jake on the porch, standing guard. It had become his habit since Carver's attack. "Pastor Williams came by while we were gone," she said eventually, handing him a cup of coffee. "Mrs. Johansson told me. He's coming back tomorrow to discuss my situation." Jake's jaw tightened. "Want me to make myself scarce?" "No." The word was firm, clear. "I'm tired of pretending, Jake. Tired of acting like you're just hired help when—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat, heat flooding her cheeks. "When what?" His voice was low and tense. She set her cup down and faced him. "When I lie awake at night thinking about you, when I watch you with my son and wish things were different." "Margaret." Her name was a groan on his lips. "You know what people will say." "They're already saying it." She moved closer, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. "I've been good, Jake. I've been proper. I wore black and kept my head down. But I'm 26 years old, and I am so tired of being alone." He set his own cup aside and reached for her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep. "Are you sure about this? Once we cross this line, there's no going back." She didn't answer with words. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was hesitant at first, then deepened as his arms came around her, pulling her tight against him. It was a kiss full of dust and coffee and loneliness, and a longing held back for far too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Woman," he breathed, "you're going to be the death of me." "I hope not," she whispered. "I've buried one man already." The next morning brought the delegation of righteousness. Pastor Williams, Mrs. Henderson, and Elijah Morse from the bank. Margaret met them on the porch. Jake stood beside her. "Mrs. Sullivan," the pastor began, his face a mask of disapproval, "we've come to discuss the irregularities in your household." "What irregularities would those be?" she asked calmly. "Don't play innocent," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "The whole town knows you've been carrying on with this drifter." "This drifter has a name," Jake said, his voice mild but edged with steel. "And I'd ask you to speak respectfully to Mrs. Sullivan." "The bank has concerns about the stability of your situation," Morse interjected smoothly. "A loan to an unmarried woman with no male protection." "I wasn't aware my marital status affected my ability to pay my debts," Margaret shot back. "My dear," the pastor said, his voice dripping with false kindness, "we are only thinking of your soul. What kind of example are you setting for your son?" "An example of hard work," she replied, "of not giving up." "An example of fornication," Mrs. Henderson burst out, "living in sin." Jake stepped forward, and all three of them instinctively took a step back. "Ma'am, I'd be real careful about making accusations you can't prove." Before anyone could respond, more horses arrived. 6 riders. Margaret's heart plummeted. In the lead was Bill Carver. "Well, well," Carver called out, his grin predatory. "Looks like a regular town meeting. You telling them about our little run-in, Ryland?" "You know this man?" the pastor asked, looking at Jake with alarm. "Oh, we go way back," Carver said with an ugly laugh. "Jake Ryland's got quite a reputation. Fast gun, faster temper. Left more than one man bleeding in the dust." "Is this true?" Mrs. Henderson gasped. "I've defended myself when necessary," Jake said, his voice dangerously level. "Modest, ain't he?" Carver sneered. Why don't you tell them about Dodge City, about Frank Morrison? Margaret saw Jake's hands clench into fists at his sides. Morrison was beating a saloon girl, Jake said, his voice tight. I stopped him. He drew on me. He lost. Killed him dead, Carver confirmed with relish. One shot. Of course, that girl was real grateful afterwards. Wasn't she, Jake? The insinuation hung in the air like poison. Mrs. Henderson looked ready to faint. I think you should all leave, Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage. Now! Her hand moved to the rifle propped against the porch rail. All of you, off my land. Carver laughed. Feisty. No wonder you like her, Rylan. He leaned forward in his saddle. Carver, you've got 10 seconds to turn that horse around. Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Something in his tone must have finally gotten through. Carver held up his hands in mock surrender. We're going. But this ain't over. The widow might want to reconsider her choices. Be a shame if something happened to this nice little ranch. After they'd all gone, a storm of silence descended. I'm sorry, Jake said quietly. My past. We all have pasts, she interrupted. You defended a woman. There's no shame in that. The town won't see it that way. Then the town can go to hell. The words felt liberating on her tongue. That night, a real storm rolled in. Not rain, but wind and lightning that tore at the sky. A soft knock came at her door. It was Jake. Wanted to check you were all right, he said, his hair wild from the wind. She should have sent him back to the barn. She should have cared about the proprieties that were already in tatters. Instead, she stepped back and let him in. The storm raged outside. Inside, the world narrowed to the space between them in the flickering lamplight. He reached for her, and she went into his arms like she was coming home. His kiss was desperate, hungry, a story of everything they'd held back. Margaret, he breathed against her lips. Tell me to leave. Tell me to go back to the barn. Stay, she whispered against his mouth. Please, Jake, stay. He pulled back, his pale eyes dark with desire. I'd give anything to court you proper, to marry you in that church. You deserve that. What I deserve, she said firmly, her hands on his face, is to choose my own path, and I choose you. Thunder crashed outside, a judgment from the heavens. But inside Margaret's small cabin, there was only the warmth of two people finding shelter in each other. Later, as he held her close in the darkness, he whispered the words that would echo in her heart for the rest of her life. I'd trade 10 herds of cattle for one night with you. And Margaret, who had thought her heart was buried with her husband, discovered it had only been sleeping, waiting. Dawn broke on a scene of utter devastation. The storm had ripped through the ranch like a clawed hand. The chicken coop was splinters. Half the corral fence was gone. The barn roof Jake had so carefully patched was now a gaping wound open to the sky. Mama, where are the chickens? Samuel's small voice was lost in the chaos. Jake emerged from the barn, his face grim. Lost 4 head of cattle. Fence gave way. Found 2 with broken legs in the gulch. Had to put them down. He met her eyes, and she saw her own despair mirrored there. The rest are scattered to hell and gone. Each loss was another turn of the screw. The bank payment was due in weeks. And now this. We'll rebuild, Jake said, his voice a raw promise. With what? Her own voice cracked. I have no money for lumber, no credit at the store. A dust cloud on the horizon announced more visitors. More trouble. It was George Dalton, the owner of the massive Double D ranch that bordered her property, with 6 men and Elijah Morse from the bank right beside him. Mrs. Sullivan, Dalton said, his voice smooth as oil. He was a big man, used to getting his way. I'll be straight with you. This land's too much for a woman alone. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer. The land is not for sale, Margaret said, the words automatic. Now don't be hasty, Morse interjected. Your payment is due in 3 weeks. With the cattle loss, the damages, you have no way to make that payment. I'm offering you a way out with dignity, Dalton finished. Refuse and the bank will foreclose. You'll leave with nothing. Margaret felt Jake tense beside her. She put a hand on his arm, a silent command to wait. So if I refuse your generous offer? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Dalton's friendly mask slipped. Then you're a fool, ma'am. This land is going to be mine one way or another. The question is whether you leave with my money in your pocket or just the clothes on your back. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war. You've got 3 weeks, Morse reminded her as they rode away. Are we going to lose our home, Mama? Samuel asked, his small face buried in her skirts. No, baby, she said, her voice fierce. This is your daddy's land. No one is taking it from us. But as she looked at the wreckage around her, she had no idea how she was going to keep that promise. The next days were a blur of desperate work. Jake patched what he could with salvaged wood. Margaret worked beside him, her hands blistering. They found 8 of the scattered cattle, but it wasn't nearly enough. On the 4th day, Jake saddled his horse. Where are you going? She asked, a knot of dread in her stomach. The Dixon Ranch is hiring for a cattle drive. It's 2 weeks' work. The pay. It might be enough. Jake, no, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything, he interrupted gently. I'm choosing to help the woman who matters to me. He touched her cheek. Take care of each other. I'll be back before the payment's due. Watching him ride away felt like having a part of herself torn out. The ranch was emptier now, more vulnerable. A week passed. No word. She sold her mother's silver comb to buy feed. Samuel grew quiet, asking every night when Jake would return. Then came the night she woke to the smell of smoke. Fire. She grabbed Samuel and ran outside. The barn was an inferno, flames clawing at the night sky. The horses were trapped inside, their screams of terror a sound that would haunt her forever. Stay here, she yelled at Samuel, shoving him toward the porch. She grabbed a blanket, threw it over her head, and ran into the burning building. The heat was a physical blow. The smoke was a choking fist down her throat. But she could hear her mare, Bess, screaming. She fumbled with the latches, eyes streaming, lungs burning. She drove the horses out, one by one. Just as she turned to follow, a burning beam crashed down, showering her with sparks. She stumbled, lost in the smoke and heat. Then strong arms grabbed her, hauling her bodily from the inferno. Damn fool woman! It was Jake's voice, rough with terror and rage. He dragged her clear, and they collapsed, coughing and gasping for air. Jake, she sobbed, barely able to see him through the smoke. How? Saw the glow from the ridge. He pulled her against him, his hands shaking as they moved over her, checking for burns. You could have died. By dawn, the barn was a skeleton of blackened timbers. Jake knelt in the ashes, holding up a charred kerosene can. It was set, he said, his voice a low growl. Carver's work, on Dalton's orders. I'd bet my life on it. It doesn't matter, Margaret said, her voice hollow. It's done. I brought my pay, Jake said, pulling a pouch from his saddlebag. It's not enough for the lumber in the bank, but... Keep it, she said, standing up, her body aching. You earned it. I won't take your money. She looked at the smoking ruins. Maybe Dalton was right. Maybe I am a fool. Don't, Jake said, his eyes fierce. Don't you dare give up. Not the woman who faced down Carver's guns and pulled 3 horses from a burning barn. That woman is tired, she whispered. That woman is beaten. He moved closer, cupping her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that cut a clean line through the soot on her cheek. That woman, he said, his voice firm, is the strongest person I've ever known, and she is not alone. Samuel, who had been watching silently, reached out and touched Jake's face. Don't go away again, the boy said. We need you. Jake's eyes never left Margaret's. I'm not going anywhere, son. Your mama's stuck with me now. A spark of hope, stubborn and defiant, rekindled in her chest. She leaned into his touch. All right, she said quietly. We fight. We fight, he agreed. Then, surrounded by the ruins of her ranch, covered in soot and sweat, with the rising sun as their witness, he kissed her. It was a promise, a declaration of war, a refusal to surrender. When they pulled apart, Samuel giggled, the first happy sound he'd made in days. And Margaret knew that even if she lost the land, she'd found something more valuable. She'd found a man who would literally walk through fire for her. Come on, Jake said, shifting Samuel into his arms. Let's see what we can salvage. We've got 2 weeks to work a miracle. As they walked toward the ruins, her hand found his, their fingers lacing together. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that made all the difference in the world. Winter came early and mean. The first snow fell in November, a deceptive blanket of white over the blackened ruins and the struggling ranch. They'd built a makeshift shelter for the horses with help from the Johansons and a few other neighbors who remembered Margaret's past kindnesses. But it was barely enough. Food was scarce. She made soup from bones she once would have thrown to the dogs. Every meal was a battle against hunger. "Mama, I'm hungry," Samuel said one evening, his small face pale. She watched Jake quietly push half his own meager portion into the child's bowl when Samuel wasn't looking. The sight was a knife in her heart. The next morning brought riders. Too many to be friendly. It was Dalton again. This time he'd brought Bill Carver and two other men who looked like hired guns. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dalton said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "A final offer. The bank payment is due in 5 days. You can't make it. I'm offering $500 for the land. Enough to start over somewhere else." "That's half what it's worth," Jake said, his voice cold as the wind. "It's more than she'll get when the bank forecloses," Dalton replied. "And considering the accidents that seem to happen around here, I'd say it's generous." The threat was naked now, shivering in the cold. "This land borders my spread," Dalton continued. "I need the water rights. One way or another, I will have them." Carver leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes filled with a sick grin. "The question is whether you leave with money in your pocket or nothing but the clothes on your back. Maybe not even those." Jake's hand moved to his gun, but Margaret stopped him. "Get off my land," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a rage that burned hotter than any fire. After they left, she sank into a chair, the weight of it all threatening to crush her. A knock at the door made them both jump. It was Henrik Johansson. "That skunk Dalton came by my place," the old farmer said, warming his hands by the stove. "Offered to buy my water rights. When I refused, one of his men mentioned how sad it would be if something happened to my granddaughter on her way to school." Margaret gasped. "They've gotten bold," Henrik said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, setting it on the table. "My Anna and I, we've been talking. You helped birth our twins. Never asked for payment." "Henrik, I can't take your money." "Not taking. Borrowing," he said, his weathered face creased in a kind smile. "Pay it back when you can. That's what neighbors do." Before she could argue, another knock came. It was Mary Patterson from the next ranch over, with a basket of preserves and dried meat. "Payment for when you helped with my husband's broken leg last spring," she said simply. Throughout the day they came. Not many, Dalton's influence kept most away. But those who came brought what they could. A few dollars, some food, a box of ammunition. By evening, the table was covered with small acts of defiance. They counted the money. Almost enough. They were still $20 short. "My pay from the cattle drive," Jake said, pulling out his own savings. "That makes it enough." "Jake, no. That's your money." "Nothing I have is mine anymore," he said simply. "It's ours. If you'll have me." The words hung in the air. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart pounding. He dropped to one knee, right there in the kitchen, with the table full of their neighbor's charity and Samuel watching with wide eyes. "I mean, I love you, Margaret Sullivan. I mean, I want to stand beside you against whatever comes. I mean, I want to be Samuel's father and your husband. If you'll have a broken-down cowboy with more past than prospects." Tears streamed down her face. "I know it's not the proposal you deserve," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "No ring, no fancy words. But I can offer you my whole heart, my gun to defend you, and my hands to work alongside you." "Say yes, Mama," Samuel piped up. "Say yes so Jake can be my papa." Margaret dropped to her knees in front of him, framing his face with her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to all of it." He kissed her then, a kiss that sealed a promise, with Samuel cheering around them. For a moment the cold and hunger and fear vanished. They had love, they had each other, and they had just enough to keep the wolves at bay. For now. The next morning they found fresh horse tracks circling the house in the snow. "Dalton's men," Jake said grimly, "testing our defenses." That night, the real wolves came, a pack driven down from the mountains by hunger. They circled the makeshift horse pen, their howls a primal song of death. Jake and Margaret stood guard together, rifles ready. The fight was brutal and swift. Jake dropped two before they even reached the fence. Margaret wounded another, but one, larger and more cunning, broke through. It went for Bess, her beloved mare. Without thinking, Margaret threw herself between the wolf and the horse, swinging her rifle like a club. The wolf's weight knocked her down, its hot, rank breath on her face, its teeth snapping inches from her throat. Jake's shot exploded in the night. The wolf collapsed on top of her. He hauled her to her feet, his voice rough with fear. "You're insane, throwing yourself at a wolf." "Bess is all I have left of the old life," she gasped, bruised but unbitten. "I couldn't lose her too." They stood there in the blood-stained snow, holding each other, surrounded by dead wolves and frightened horses. They had won, but as they dragged the carcasses away, they both saw them. Fresh horse tracks in the snow, alongside the wolf tracks, and the faint glint of light from a nearby ridge. Someone had been watching, waiting, hoping the wolves would do their dirty work for them. The bank payment was due in 3 days, and the two-legged wolves were getting impatient. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge was cold and imposing. Margaret climbed the steps, Jake on one side, Samuel on the other. The pouch with the payment was tucked inside her coat, a small, heavy weight against her heart. The courtroom was packed. It was a spectacle. The rich man, Dalton, finally making his move on the stubborn widow. "Right on time, Mrs. Sullivan," Elijah Morse said, his smile thin as a razor's edge. "I trust you have the payment." "Every penny," she said. "Ah, but first," Morse said, gesturing to the judge's bench, "there's a small matter to address. Mr. Dalton has filed a claim questioning your legal right to the property." Her blood ran cold. George Dalton stood, flanked by two lawyers in expensive city suits. "It's simple, Your Honor. I've discovered irregularities in the original land deed. The property boundaries don't match the federal survey." "That's a lie," Margaret cried out. "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice a low rumble, "this is nothing but a wealthy man trying to steal from a widow." Judge Carlton peered over his spectacles. "And you are?" "Jake Ryland, Mrs. Sullivan's intended." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I see," the judge said, his tone disapproving. "Well, Mr. Dalton has presented documentation, unless Mrs. Sullivan can prove her claim." One of Dalton's lawyers unrolled a map with official-looking seals. "Your Honor, our surveyor has found that the Sullivan property encroaches on Mr. Dalton's land by nearly 40 acres, including the water rights to Clear Creek." The trap was sprung. Without the water from the creek, the land was worthless. Even if she kept the ranch, she'd be ruined. "This is fraud," Jake said flatly. "That map's been doctored." The lawyer, a man named Crawford, sneered. "A serious accusation, Mr. Ryland. Can you prove it?" "Can you prove it isn't?" Jake shot back. Dalton's surveyor, a nervous man named Hicks, took the stand. His testimony was technical and damning. According to him, Thomas Sullivan had claimed land that was never his. "Do you have any witnesses to refute this?" the judge asked Margaret. Her mind raced. Then a spark of inspiration. "Henrik Johansson," she said. "He homesteaded here before my husband. He knows the true boundaries." The old farmer made his way to the stand. "Mr. Johansson," Margaret began, acting as her own lawyer, "the boundary between our properties?" "Clear Creek," Henrik answered, his voice firm. "Always has been. I helped Thomas Sullivan survey it myself when he bought the land. We used the federal markers. Stone cairns, placed by the Army surveyors." Crawford jumped up. "Hearsay. Where are these supposed markers?" Henrik's face darkened. "Funny thing about that, went to check them last month. They were gone, dug up and recent like." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. "So it's your word against our survey," Crawford said dismissively. "Not just my word," Henrik said calmly. He pulled out a worn notebook. "I keep records. Weather, crops, boundaries." He opened it to a specific page. "August 15th, 1876. Helped Army surveyors place markers. Stone cairns 3 feet high at quarter-mile intervals along Clear Creek. Even got their names. Lieutenant Morrison and Surveyor McKnight." Crawford's smirk faltered. Those men could be dead. McKnight's not dead, a voice called from the back of the room. It was Doc Hartley. He's my brother-in-law, lives in Denver. I could wire him. Dalton stood up, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. We're taking the word of an old immigrant and a woman of questionable morals against an official survey. Questionable morals, Margaret's temper flared. You've been living with a known gunman, not your husband, Dalton boomed. You've proven you can't manage the land. The barn burned, you lost your cattle. For the good of the community, this land should be in responsible hands. For the good of your bank account, you mean? She shot back. You want my water rights because you've overgrazed your own land. You tried to buy me out, burn me out, and now you're trying to law me out. Can you prove Mr. Hicks even surveyed that land? Jake challenged, his eyes locked on the nervous surveyor. Or did he just draw the lines where Dalton told him to? Hicks went pale. I stand by my survey. Would you stake your professional reputation on it? Jake pressed. That you personally measured every foot? Hicks glanced at Dalton, then looked at his feet. There may have been some estimates. The courtroom erupted. Your Honor, a new voice cut through the chaos. It was Pastor Williams. Margaret's heart sank. He was here to condemn her. I have something to say, the pastor said, his face pale but determined. Last week I overheard Mr. Carver and another man laughing about digging up some old stones near Clear Creek on Mr. Dalton's orders. I thought nothing of it then. But now, Carver shot to his feet. That's a damn lie. Is it? The pastor said, standing straighter. I may not approve of Mrs. Sullivan's choices, but I approve less of bearing false witness. The courtroom exploded. Dalton's face was a mask of purple rage. Judge Carlton's gavel cracked. Sheriff, detain Mr. Carver for questioning. And Mr. Hicks, I'm recommending a full investigation into your professional conduct. He turned to Margaret, his expression wary. Mrs. Sullivan, do you have your payment? With shaking hands, she produced the pouch. Every dollar, Your Honor. Then the bank must accept it. The question of the boundaries will be investigated. But until fraud can be proven, the Sullivan Ranch remains in your possession. The gavel fell. It was over. Dalton stormed out. Carver was escorted away by the sheriff, but not before he gave Jake a look that promised a reckoning beyond any courtroom. Outside in the cold, bright sun, Margaret sagged against Jake. We did it. You did it, he corrected, wrapping an arm around her. You and your neighbors. Does this mean we get to keep our home? Samuel asked. Yes, sweet boy, she said, lifting him into her arms. We get to keep our home. And Jake gets to stay forever? Jake met her eyes over the boy's head. If your mama will have me. Forever, she confirmed. And she didn't care who saw as Jake kissed her, right there on the courthouse steps. They had won the battle. But as they rode home, Margaret knew the war wasn't over. Dalton would never forgive this humiliation. And Carver was a snake who would be looking for revenge. Spring came like an answered prayer. Green shoots pushed through the soil. Wildflowers carpeted the prairie. Clear Creek ran full and strong. The barn was rebuilt, smaller but sturdier, a testament to the neighbors who had rallied around them after the trial. The sweet smell of fresh-cut lumber filled the air. Margaret watched Jake and Samuel working with a young colt in the new corral. Her heart swelled. Tomorrow Jake would legally become Samuel's father. Tomorrow they would be married. Pastor Williams, his conscience pricked by Dalton's villainy, had agreed to perform the ceremony right there in the yard. As she turned to go inside, she saw a lone rider approaching fast. Her hand went to the rifle by the door. Old habits. It was Sheriff Thompson. His face was grim. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, tipping his hat. Thought you should know. Bill Carver broke jail last night. Killed a deputy doing it. The world tilted on its axis. Any idea where he went? Jake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Trail led north, the sheriff said. But a man like Carver doesn't run without settling scores first. I'd post a watch if I were you. After he left, Jake began methodically checking his weapons. Maybe we should postpone the wedding, she said, her voice a whisper. No, Jake's voice was firm. We've put our lives on hold for men like Carver and Dalton long enough. Tomorrow we get married, but tonight I keep watch. Not alone, she said, touching his face. That night on the porch, he told her the full story. The woman in Dodge City had been Carver's girl, barely 17 and terrified of him. Jake's intervention had sent Carver to prison for 2 years. He blames me for everything that went wrong in his life, Jake said quietly. And now he's lost again, because of us, she said. Because of his own choices, Jake corrected. Men like him never learn that. The night passed. Dawn brought her wedding day, a glorious wash of gold and pink across the sky. She wore her mother's wedding dress, old-fashioned ivory silk. You look pretty, Mama, Samuel said solemnly. Beautiful, Jake corrected from the doorway. The ceremony was simple, held under a bower of spring branches. Their few true friends were there. As Pastor Williams began to speak, all she could see was Jake's face, the love and promise in his eyes. I, Jake Ryland, take you, Margaret Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife, in drought and in plenty, through storms and sunshine, until death do us part. Her own voice was strong and clear as she repeated her vows, sealing her promise to stand beside him, to build with him, to love him forever. I now pronounce you man and wife. Jake's kiss was tender, and their friends erupted in cheers. He lifted Samuel up, and the three of them stood together. A family, at last. The celebration was joyful. A fiddler played, and tables groaned with food brought by their neighbors. Dance with me, Mrs. Ryland, Jake said, and she melted into his arms. That sounds strange, she laughed. Good strange, he murmured. The best strange. As the sun began to set, she saw Jake tense. He was looking past the celebration, toward the property line. She followed his gaze. A lone figure on horseback, Dalton. He sat there for a long moment, watching them, watching their happiness. Then slowly, he turned his horse and rode away. It wasn't a surrender. It was a truce, born of defeat. He had lost. Just as the thought crossed her mind, a shot rang out from the opposite direction, from the rocks overlooking the creek. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. The fiddler's music died in a screech. Jake shoved her and Samuel to the ground behind a water trough. Carver! Another shot kicked up dirt right where they had been standing. He's on the ridge! Henrik Johansson yelled, pointing. Jake drew his pistol. Stay down! Don't move! He fired 2 shots toward the rocks, not to hit, but to provide cover. Get the women and children in the house, he yelled to Henrik. Margaret watched, her heart in her throat as her friends scrambled for safety. This was her wedding day, her one day of peace, and he was here to turn it into a bloodbath. No, she whispered. She looked at the house. The rifle was still propped by the door. Margaret, no! Jake yelled, seeing the look in her eye. But she was already moving. Scrambling on her hands and knees, keeping low, she made it to the porch. Her hands closed around the familiar, smooth wood of the rifle stock. She could see him now, a silhouette against the dying sun. He was reloading. She rested the rifle on the porch railing, just as Thomas had taught her. She lined up the sights. She took a breath. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The silhouette on the ridge staggered. He fired one last wild shot into the sky before he crumpled and disappeared from view. Silence. Then Jake was beside her, his pistol still drawn, his eyes scanning the ridge. Stay here, he said, his voice tight. He and Henrik and 2 other men rode cautiously toward the ridge. Margaret waited, her body trembling, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. Samuel ran to her, burying his face in her wedding dress. They came back minutes later. Jake dismounted and walked toward her. His face was unreadable. It's over, he said quietly. He's dead. She finally let the rifle fall from her numb fingers. She pulled Jake and Samuel into a fierce hug. It was truly over. The guests eventually left, their joy replaced by a somber relief. As night fell, Margaret and Jake stood on the porch, the scent of rain finally, truly on the wind. The drought was ending. The fight was over. Some wedding day, she said softly. He turned her to face him. We're alive. We're together. That's all that matters. Together, she agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. The ranch prospered. Dalton, humbled and exposed, eventually sold his holdings and moved away. The town, having seen Margaret's courage and Jake's devotion, finally welcomed them. Samuel grew tall and strong, a perfect mix of his mother's spirit and the quiet strength of the man he called Papa. On their first anniversary, Jake pulled her close as they watched the sunset. "I'd still trade 10 herds for one night with you," he whispered. She laughed, the sound bright and free. "Good thing you don't have to. You've got me for every night, forever." "Forever," he agreed. They had started with nothing but loss and loneliness. They had faced down drought, greed, and violence. But in the end, love had won. Not the easy kind, but the hard-won kind. The kind forged in fire and tempered by courage. The widow and the drifter. They had found their home. It was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this story of the Wild West. I hope the journey of Margaret and Jake resonated with you as much as it did with me. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're tuning in from a Texas ranch, a busy city apartment, or somewhere else entirely. Every story has a favorite moment. What was yours? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more authentic tales from the frontier, filled with courage, struggle, and love, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got a lot more stories to tell.